Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the University of Texas Energy Symposium sponsored by the Energy Institute. I'm Kerry King, research scientist and assistant director at the Energy Institute. And before I introduce today's speaker on April 4th, 2023, let me inform you of the last two upcoming talks for this semester. Next week, we will have another economist, Gail Giroud, who is professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University and the founder and director of the Georgetown Environmental Justice Program. He'll talk about his economic modeling work in the context of finance and climate change. And then for the last talk of the semester, April 13th, we will have our Dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, J.R. DeShazo, talk about job creation and electric vehicles. But today it is the pleasure to have a colleague, Lisi Krall, who's a professor of economics at the State University of New York, Cortland. Title of her talk is Energy and the Evolution of the Human Economy. And she will talk about many things, including items from her book, Bitter Harvest, an inquiry into the war between economy and Earth. So just a little bit more of a background on Lisi. She's a professor of economics, again, at the State University of New York, Cortland. She engages in heterodox and trans-disciplinary approach to understanding economic systems, their etiology, structure, dynamic, and the relationship between humans and the more than human world that is contextualized through them. She incorporates many ideas, including evolutionary biology, anthropology, history, heterodox economics, to understand how we arrived at this historical moment and where there is a war between economy and Earth, and the great difficulty in altering this tension. So a brief abstract of her talk. Some of you may be aware of economist Nicholas Goergescu-Roegen, who wrote a book called The Entropy Law and the Economic Process, a book that many of people in our field have read and used to inspire their work. So his work resonated in the shadow of the upper neck of exponential growth, dependence on fossil fuels and global warming. The earthly economists continue to put together a story of economic systems, and in particular, this economic system that we experience today and its relationship to the Earth. Yet, in this exercise, it is important to understand that economic systems must be understood expansively and not reduced to mere energy calculations. Goergescu-Roegen also said that, quote here, the entropy law is the only natural law that does not predict quantitatively. It does not specify how great the increase should be at a future moment, or to say how big entropy will increase, or what particular entropic pattern will result. Because of this fact, there is an entropic indeterminateness in the real world, which allows life to acquire an endless spectrum of forms. And Lisi will inform us about these different kinds of forms and comparisons. She would like to add endless forms of economic systems as well. So the agricultural revolution is used here in her talk as an example of the emergence of a categorically different economic system that altered the relationship of humans to other humans and to the Earth, changing the energetics of human economic order. Focusing on this transition, say, to agriculture through transdisciplinary work that includes heterodox economics, evolutionary biology, anthropology, and history, reveals the complexity of economic systems and helps us ask the right questions in our present energy transition. So I wanted to read the complete abstract for Lisi. She will emphasize many of these ideas going forward, since I think it is great to hear them more than once. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Lisi. She is going to be speaking without slides. And so please ask a question within the Q&A or question and answer feature of chat at any time, and I will pass these over as soon as I can for clarifying questions and for those at the end. So I will now stop talking. Lisi, the floor is yours.
Okay, Kerry, thanks so much. And thanks for inviting me here today. And also thanks to David Tuttle for helping to orchestrate my talk. I realize that this is a series on energy that focuses on energy. But as Kerry said, my focus has always been on the human relationship to the more than human world and how that relationship is contextualized in economic systems. So I'm here to talk about that today. That is the evolution, the structure and dynamic, especially of one particular economic system, which I have labeled in my book, The Economic Superorganism. Energy is part of the story, but it isn't the whole story. And I also want to just position myself for you. I do believe that we have a formidable problem with our economic system and the planetary boundaries of the Earth. So I'm in that camp without equivocation. Having said that, I'm not a person who believes that the end of the world or collapse is coming in 10 years. Okay. And what I'm going to try to do in this talk here is give you some idea of how I've been thinking about things. I want to say that I don't have, obviously, a monopoly on truth, and that my only goal in the work that I've done is to try to create conversation and to have a more expansive conversation about our present predicament. The economic superorganism is an economic system that began, in my mind, with the cultivation of annual grains in humans. It also occurred in the cultivation of fungi with ants, some ants and termites. And it was a wholly different economic system than what humans had been participating in or contextualized in for the 200 to 300,000 years of their history that preceded that revolution. The economic superorganism reconfigured the relationship of humans to each other, and it reconfigured the relationship of humans to the more than human world. And it also changed the energetics of human society. I think that economic system change is with us now in the form of globalized capitalism. So I see our present system as the legacy of that previous revolution. What I want to emphasize here today are a couple of things. First, that economic systems should not be reduced to an energy calculus. I think it's a mistake to do that. Economic systems, both in their formation and their structure and dynamic, are very complex systems. While energy is certainly a part of that, it should not be the central focus of analysis. Even our present system, with its use of highly dense carbon in the form of fossil fuel. In fact, a better focus, in my mind, is to see the economic system in the light of our ongoing social evolution and its dialectical dance with Earth. Second, I want to emphasize that the economic system that began with agriculture, and I'm repeating what I said a couple minutes ago, is still with us in the form of global capitalism. And the challenge of our present system cannot be reduced merely to solving our energy problem, that is, getting out of the mess of fossil fuels and global warming. And finally, I want to emphasize that the economic superorganism is a universal system, organizing many species, not just ours, although they don't organize into globalized capitalism, I realize that. And this should make us humble. And it should make us wary of thinking that we are entirely in control of even what we think we're in control of. It should also make us, as it has made me, curious about our economic system and where it might lie in the complexity of evolution. As Carrie announced, I have published a book called Bitter Harvest with SUNY Press. And if you have any curiosity about what I have to say here today, that book is now out in paperback, so it's relatively economical. You can check it out if you're interested. My work technically lies in the field of ecological economics. Some of you may have some familiarity with ecological economics. But I differ with ecological economics in some important ways. I waste no time valuing ecosystem services and natural capital. I don't discount that, but I waste no time with it. In fact, I think the latter terminology is confusing and somewhat unproductive in moving our conversation about real ecological rapprochement with the Earth forward. And although I've been influenced by Herman Daly and Nicholas Goergescu-Roegen, who Carrie talked about, two of the seminal thinkers in ecological economics, I don't follow narrowly in the footsteps of either of them. Daly's approach highlighted the need to manage scale and redistribute income, telling us that we can't have unlimited growth on a finite planet. But in Daly's work, there's been little focus on the structure and dynamic of the economic system sufficient to explain its imperative growth, nor the inequality that's reliably generated along the way. He never seems to get at the root of the problem, though he does have a clear sense they need to be managed. Although Daly does connect the economy to the earth, certainly in the context of scale, he does this in a somewhat superficial way. His materialism, and I call this a materialism, connecting the economy to the earth, leads him to vague references to development without growth and accepting markets with a small n, but not with a large M. It certainly doesn't lead to understanding the formation of the economic system that we have and the alienation that has been created between it and the earth, okay? Goergescu-Roegen had more appreciation for the dynamic life of an economic system and recognized in his work on entropy that the quote that Carrie just read, the entropy law is the only natural law that does not predict quantitatively. It does not specify how great the increase should be at a future moment or what particular entropic pattern will result. Because of this fact, there is an entropic indeterminateness in the real world, which allows life to acquire an endless spectrum of forms. And I would also add, different economic systems can form. Unfortunately, Goergescu-Roegen doesn't explore these forms in great detail, but he also suggested that the roots of growth lay deep in human nature, and he advised economists to look at the economic process from a physiological and evolutionary viewpoint in dialectical manner, and stop thinking in what he called the timeless kinematics of the dominant economic paradigm, that is neoclassical economics. That is to say, the movement from one equilibrium to another with little sense of history or the movement over time. So although Nicholas Goergescu-Roegen had an interest in the dynamic life of the economic system, this challenge has yet to reach full potential in ecological economics. In the end, it seemed like Goergescu-Roegen's legacy went in the direction of a narrow concentration on energy and the importance of the Entropy Law in getting us to think about irreversibilities and limits to economic processes. His work has been especially influential in this time of the use of fossil fuels. But again, a narrow focus on energy, I believe, is not the best way to understand economic systems, especially if what we want to understand is how they position humans relative to the earth. Oddly, this focus on energy and entropy led ecological economics away from the use of a materialist methodology, which had a long history in economic thought, because the economic thinkers who were using this methodology were accused of not understanding the entropy law, and they were prematurely discounted for that. And then their methodology was more or less ignored, sort of a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So ecological economics attempts to reconnect the economy to the earth. But in my mind, it was also important to understand how this system had come to function as if the earth was irrelevant, or more accurately, apart from the earth. It seemed to me, when I look out at the world, that we have an economic system that is a material system. That much is clear, despite the fact that the connection was lost to most of economic thought. But at the same time, it is a system that functions as if it's not a material system. For example, it's a system with an impulse to expand. It's a system that reliably generates inequality. It's a system subject to depressions and stagnation because of its internal logic, and not because of some resource scarcity nor simple greed. It's a system that functions as if profit-making is an unlimited proposition. So it isn't simply necessary to highlight the material connectedness of the economy to Earth in some superficial sense, as the ecological economists have done well, it's necessary to explain how a material system becomes, for want of a better word, insular from the Earth, a supramaterial system, if you will. I've been interested in this strange duality, this rather bizarre alienation embodied in the economic system, which is often blamed on economic thought, but it seems to me it isn't simply a problem of economic thought, which can be flawed. It's a matter of some level of economic reality. In order to understand my emphasis on this duality, it's important to have a little background. I have been influenced by several significant seminal thinkers. One was the human ecologist Paul Shepard, who did a lot of work on hunters and gatherers and the human transition to agriculture. He didn't analyze that in the context of economic systems, but he did a lot of work on that transition. The other was Wes Jackson, who, with his knack for fantastic aphorisms, said humans became a species out of context with agriculture. These two thinkers started me thinking more critically about the agricultural revolution and its significance in human history, because it was clear to me that the agricultural revolution had repositioned humans in relation to Earth. So I had a curiosity about the importance of the agricultural revolution that most ecological economists and ecological political economists don't have. In that curiosity, I've been fortunate to have been supported and accompanied by my colleague, John Gowdy, who was one of the few economists that I knew that also thought this was something worth exploring. And let me say that generally, I've been influenced by a wide spectrum of economic thinkers, but especially those that think the economy, the way to analyze the economy is by looking at its dynamic and evolution over time. John Gowdy and I wondered whether what might be garnered from looking more closely at the agricultural revolution, what we could understand in terms of where we are today. But we extended this curiosity to an exploration of the similarities between agricultural humans and agricultural insects, for the simple reason that there are similarities. Most economists who are interested in the connection between economy and Earth don't concentrate on the significance of the agricultural revolution, and they certainly don't draw insight into the evolution of economic systems from a comparison to insect agriculturalists. The quintessential example, of course, being the leafcutter ants. Needless to say, we've been isolated in our work. And as an aside, since this is an energy forum, it was Charlie Hall, who's done a lot of work on energy return on energy investment. And some of you might be familiar with him in that area. It was Charlie that introduced me to John. So I've been interested in looking at the significance of the agricultural revolution in establishing a problematic path in terms of the human relationship to Earth. But I've been equally interested in the complexity of economic system formation because of the similarity between these diverse species that organize around cultivation. The challenge of investigating this similarity is that it required that I invest some in thinking about that commonality. It was clear that the commonality between some insects and humans was an evolved sociality. And it was also clear that sociality was similarly expressed, or perhaps a better word is structured in an economic system. So I began to look at the literature on evolution, but particularly evolution as it pertained to sociality, the sociality of groups, of cooperation. I was also drawn to the evolution of sociality through my appreciation of Karl Marx. I quote Bellamy Foster, who paraphrases Marx. The relation between the organic body of a human being and the inorganic world is one that is conditioned by the subsistence needs of human beings and their capacity through social labor to transform the external conditions of nature into a means of satisfying these needs. Actually, there's a lot of economic thinkers who are drawn to the area of social labor. Adam Smith, in his book, The Wealth of Nations, starts out the first 3 chapters on the division of labor. Of course, his analysis takes a different path. But we can think of the division of labor certainly as the expression of sociality on the economic plane. In the parlance of evolutionary biology, I attached myself to group and multi-level selection, and I began to interpret the evolution of the agricultural system through the lens of an evolved sociality, and then the co-evolution, an extension of that sociality with the cultivars, forming a distinct economic system. And I want to emphasize that the agricultural revolution is not merely about a different way of procuring food. It's about a whole different economic system. I found the agricultural system to be a particular play on sociality. In that the system inevitably results in the expansion of the division of labor around the focal point of cultivation. This is true for many species of ants and termites that cultivate, and for humans as well. Even so, I differed with this group, the evolutionary biologists, especially when it came to humans, because those evolutionary biologists interested in the evolution of cooperation and sociality looked at the capacity for culture as the pinnacle of human social evolution, and the agricultural revolution was then just seen as a cultural matter. This is what bothered me about that. Insect superorganisms engaged agriculture. Their sociality gets extended through an elaborated division of labor around the focal point of cultivation, much like humans. They become super expansionary in those systems. They have very similar feedback loops, and one can hardly claim they have culture. That's when I started to think of the agricultural system as a universal system that had captured many social species. And I started thinking that in the formation of the agricultural system, culture helped to elaborate the division of labor, which is the expression of social labor, much like mutation and selection elaborate the division of labor in agricultural insects. But in the end, the outcome is the same. The same kind of economic system is formed, and economics, what I call an economic superorganism. So culture isn't the main story in my story. The whole story is that an evolved sociality was hijacked, if you will, by an emergent agricultural system that appeared to me to be universal. I actually, again, began to wonder where the economic system might lie in the complexity of evolution. I could see that the agricultural system becomes its own thing with its particular feedback loops. And more importantly, in the case of humans, human economic life, in some sense, becomes removed from the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human world. So it repositions human in relation to the world, the earth. Now, I realize that this might seem counterintuitive to you, but humans were no longer embedded in the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human world in the same way they were previous to the agricultural revolution. Their connection with the earth becomes narrowly focused around the cycle of annual grains and associated pests and predators, and of course, their domesticated animals, not following the migratory paths of animals, for example. Women's role becomes narrowly focused around reproduction, and the division of labor gets expanded around this focal point of cultivation and the surplus created therein. Interdependence and the division of labor around the focal point of cultivation form a foundational stanchion for a different kind of economic system. And again, this is true for all species that practice cultivation. Powerful feedback loops ensued between population, cultivation, division of labor. And these are especially pronounced for humans with their coevolution with annual grains and the human capacity for culture. Annual grains are a particularly, an especially expansionary proposition. I say this, when the axis around which the division of labor rotates is the focus cultivation of food, which is also to say the focus, again, production of energy in some sense, a very powerful feedback mechanism is engaged. But I want you to keep in mind that the production of food is not only that it provides energy, it also provides vitamins, minerals, and all of the other things that life needs, Okay, so it's not just energy. And it isn't just that there are powerful feedback loops, nor that the energetics of the system are different. It's the way the system integrates and structures sociality through the division of labor around the focal point of cultivation, creating what I saw as a new whole in the material organization of society, a new kind of economic system, an economic superorganism. So the energetics and expression of sociality in an agricultural system are entirely different than they were for humans in a hunting and gathering system. And the relationship between humans and the earth are entirely different. Now, for humans, there are many elaborations to the agricultural system because humans are not insects, okay? Hierarchy, markets, money, debt, irrigation, private property are but a few examples. And that means that humans have elaborations of the system that insects don't. But in my mind, the elaborations need to be separated, if you will, from the foundational architecture of the system, which again appears to be universal. The truth is, our collective alienation for the more than human world, contextualized in the economic superorganism, has been with us a long time. It didn't start with capitalism and the industrial revolution around fossil fuels. And the foundational system put in play with agriculture has not changed in some fundamental ways. Profound material interdependence, expansion and surplus, duality between humans and earth, and an economic system that is a thing unto itself. Well, of course, the economic system can't be a thing unto itself because it's a material system. And so we see after the agricultural revolution and the rise of civilizations, the reliable collapse of civilizations in the millennia after the agricultural revolution. Annual grains were a really good co-evolutionary option, but they're a terrible ecological proposition. Let me reiterate. Humans are not insects. Humans are individually intelligent. They innovate and they carry their innovations forward from generation to generation. So their culture and technologies are cumulative and additive. They develop hierarchies and institutions like markets that feed back into the system. So humans have in fact enhanced feedback loops that insects don't have. But this is the thing, despite all these features of humans that insect agriculturalists don't have, humans never escape the economic system that began with grain agriculture. They only extend and elaborate it. Now, fast forward to our present economic system, that of capitalism. I argue that capitalism is a system within a system. It is the legacy of the agricultural revolution. Capitalism changes the form of surplus and expansion, but not the fact of their existence. It alters the human-to-human relationships, but it did not change the fact of enhanced interdependence nor hierarchy. Finally, capitalism drove the wedge of duality between humans and the more than human world ever deeper, but it didn't create that duality. Again, my argument is that humans became disembedded from the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human world with agriculture. capitalism is an extension of this disembeddedness and the duality that exists. Now, there are a couple things about capitalism that I think you need to keep in mind, especially since many of you are focused on energy. Capitalism was a fully established system by the time the Industrial Revolution around fossil fuel took place. Yes, a change occurred in capitalism as a result of the Industrial Revolution around fossil fuel. There is no doubt about that. But the form of its surplus did not change, because the surplus that had begun in agriculture had evolved over time, and so had markets. The form of surplus in a capitalist system is profit, which is an institutional form of surplus. And here I want to stress something that people forget. Insofar as there are problems with the system, the problems are not simply greedy capitalists. I don't doubt there's plenty of greed, nor do I doubt that government often seems to side with the economically powerful, nor is there any question that the economically powerful are more powerful than ever. But unfortunately, our problem is more foundational. Again, I'm going to quote Marx. The capitalist shares with the miser the passion for wealth as wealth. But that which in the miser is a mere idiosyncrasy is in the capitalist the effect of a social mechanism of which he is but one of the wheels. The development of capitalist production compels him to constantly extend his capital in order to preserve it. Okay? So again, I stress that while the use of fossil fuel altered capitalism, it did not change the form of surplus or the particular social arrangements that had evolved around that. Capitalism was a system already disconnected from the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human with this very institutional form of surplus. But there is no question that the system becomes much more disconnected with the advent of fossil fuel in the sense that the dynamic of profit making becomes seemingly unlimited. Let me repeat, the dynamic of profit becomes seemingly unlimited when fertilized with fossil fuel. And fossil fuel sets up more profound contradictions and tensions in the system, tensions that are not dependent on biophysical factors. For example, the problem of overproduction, underconsumption, the more pronounced depressions, ever-increasing crises, greater inequality, and the continual imperative to find new markets. So it's a rather bizarre thing, really, that as the system becomes more expansive in its material demands, it becomes more insular and self-referential as an economic system. The duality that began with the other agricultural revolution reaches an apogee with the use of fossil fuels and its marriage to capitalism, where I believe the economy or the economic system functions in a supramaterial sense. At the same time, it has never been more profoundly material in terms of its demands on the earth. It doesn't surprise me in all of this that economists mostly forgot about the connection of the economy to the earth. In a sense, this disposition reflected something real. In my work, I ultimately divide economists into two groups, and I don't want to make too much of this, but it was a way that I could connect duality with economic thinking. I based my categorization of economists on whether they place the earth as a central focus of their analysis. And so I divide economists into two groups, the unearthly philosophers and the earthly philosophers, playing on Robert Heilbroner's book, The Worldly Philosophers. And when I did this, I found rather strange bedfellows because I got Marx and Veblen and neoclassicals and Keynes and Adam Smith, mostly in the camp of the unearthly philosophers. Again, It wasn't based on whether or not they're, they had any ecological sense or had mentioned the Earth. It was whether that was a focus of their analysis. And then I had Daly, Goergescu-Roegen, John Bellamy Foster, Paul Burkett, Jason Moore. I put in the camp of earthly philosophers because the relationship of the economy to the Earth was a central focus of their work. I didn't do a detailed analysis of the unearthly philosophers. That was not my point. And I don't get into academic wars about which economists did or didn't have some element of an ecological eye. There are a lot of economists who are doing that. My position was that the worldly philosophers were focused on an economic system that clearly functioned by its own logic, its own internal dynamic and structure. And they were by and large, the unearthly philosophers were by and large exploring that, okay? Even in their exploration of the creation of value. And this fit in with the duality that I saw in the economic system that had begun with the agricultural revolution. The economy had become a thing unto itself, removed from the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human world. And this had been going on for 10,000 years. Was reaching its apogee in our present system. The earthly philosophers, as I have said before, had been centered on connecting the economy to Earth. But even so, there is much work that remains to be done in order to carry this mission forward. Okay. As I've said before, ecological economics connection to the Earth has been mostly descriptive, important to be sure, but descriptive. The circular flow of income and spending the cycles of the Earth get superimposed on the circular flow of income and spending. But in my mind, materialism needs to reach deep into the realm of understanding the formation of an economic system. It needs to tap into the deep history of our individual and collective relationship with the more than human world, and more importantly, how that relationship takes form in an economic system. And I found evolutionary biology essential to my own thinking on this matter, especially again as it relates to the evolution of sociality and cooperation. It wasn't a narrow focus on the energy calculus that informed my thinking, although energetics is clearly a part of economic system formation. It was the particular social evolution of humans in dialectical dance with that Holocene opening into annual grains. Some of the earthly philosophers, what I call the ecological political economists, have engaged a more foundational materialism or historical perspective than Daly did. But they have neglected to take it far back enough into the history, into our history. Their focus has been mainly capitalism. Had they taken their analysis farther back into human history, they would have been forced to think more fully about what it means to have an economy embedded in the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human world. Sustainability might have been replaced with a deeper ecology of embeddedness. Sociality might have been more about the relationship to the Earth and less about class. And they would have been forced to think more clearly about the duality between humans and Earth that had taken form and the categorically different relationship with the Earth that had begun with the agricultural revolution. I believe this insight would have brought them to more probing questions of our present challenge, that we're not simply trying to find a safe operating space for humans. We're trying to find a relationship with the Earth that gives the more than humans a safe operating space. Now, I'm going to close here and I'm going to offer just a few thoughts, okay? I'm reticent to talk about human nature when I see that humans became Homo sapiens agriculturali with the agricultural revolution, when they became members of the economic superorganism. Our nature is clearly a complex matter, and its expression is at least partly contextual. We are struggling with our nature now. What I don't want to do is to have questions of our nature degenerate into discussions of all the ways that humans are exceptional, at the expense of never talking about all the ways they're not exceptional. I mean, one of the reasons that I undertook this comparison of agriculturalists was to show that even in ways we think we're different, we're not that different. And this should make us humble again and a bit more critical and discerning about our power to change things. We have a very powerful and enduring system on our hands, and it's not that easy to change it. I do see economic formation as a dialectical dance between Earth and social humans. So in that sense, I follow a materialist and an evolutionary methodology. But I will also say this, evolution is not something that is imbued with teleological purpose, at least not from my perspective. Both the seemingly perfect and the imperfect come out of the evolutionary sphere. And I certainly don't see capitalism as some aberration of our nature, but I also don't see it as the pinnacle of evolutionary success either. For me, the benefit of using evolution is to think about economic systems is not in highlighting that Homo economicus is an inaccurate portrayal of human nature, nor is the benefit of using evolution found in talking about how we're caught in this problematic mismatch between our inclinations evolved in a different time and our present world. For me, the benefit of evolution is to understand the evolution of humans into cultural cooperative species, and then to understand the co-evolutionary dance of that sociality and annual grains into an economic superorganism, a species with a profoundly altered relationship to Earth. And yes, there is an altered energetics to human life as a result. There is no question about that. But to limit the story to energy leaves us with an incomplete understanding of our challenge, which is the challenge of our own complicated nature and repositioning our collective selves in relation to the Earth. It seems to me we find ourselves two things at once. We're Homo sapiens sapiens, a species honed in the Pleistocene, and Homo sapiens agriculturali, a species honed in the Holocene, and now on a particularly problematic path that we can't seem to measurably alter. Focus is important in this kind of confusion. And I can relate this to our present energy landscape and challenge. The challenge of getting off of fossil fuel to prevent further warming of the planet due to the buildup of greenhouse gases needs to be subsumed under the more formidable challenge of repositioning ourselves in relation to the more than human world. Repositioning ourselves needs to have economic system meaning. Without this wider angled lens, there is a tendency to uncritically accept the agenda of switching to renewable energy as the last or most important word. I do think we have to switch out of the use of highly dense carbon found in fossil fuel, but to blindly accept that this can be a seamless transition or that it will create real rapprochement with Earth is pure folly. I think it's fair to say, given the calculations of EROEI on renewables, the fact that renewable energy is not highly concentrated energy, the problem with storage and intermittency, and the present problems of distribution of energy, and the fact that about 1 billion people on the planet don't have reliable access to energy now, and that fact that we have a system of endless profit, given all of this, I think it's fair to say we need a more incisive and expansive discussion of our energy challenge, one that moves beyond the blind belief that we can simply replace one type of energy with another, to a discussion of system change and the focal point of human relationship to the more than human world. The question of limits needs to be front and center in our discussion about energy. What is the best way to orchestrate limits? And the question of embeddedness needs to be front and center in our discussion of sustainability. If we have an economic system that is not embedded in the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human world, and it's not, then it must be contained. Otherwise, the sixth mass extinction reaches its conclusion. And I don't know that that's what we want. So I'm going to end there and open it up to any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisi. So yeah, we do have a few questions coming in, so I'll put mine to the side. So I'll point out that so as Lisi mentioned herself, John Gowdy. We've also had Nathan Hagen speak as part of the series. All speak of the economic superorganism, and I'm not sure how far back that phrase goes. I think at least a few decades. And the title of my book, so not originated by me, but by many of these others who thought before me. So here's a question. How does your earthly and unearthly philosopher concept diverge from Herman Daly's division of steady state versus growth economies? Any expansion on that question?
Between steady state and growth?
Yes, I guess Daly just making this distinction between a steady state versus a growth economy, and maybe what other kinds of structures you did mention.
I guess I think that I'm just talking about a different plane of analysis than Herman Daly is. That's what I would say. So the central focus of my analysis has been on this issue of duality, this issue of the economic system taking a form that is disembedded from the rhythm and dynamic of the more than human world. And presumably you can have economists that are talking about a steady state who don't necessarily recognize that duality. Okay. And so I would answer that simply by saying, I think we're just talking about things at a different level. Okay. That would be my simple answer to that.
Right. Okay. Let me have a little bit of a follow-up there. So use the phrase, more than human, and you were thinking about ants long before I was, and once I started thinking about ants, I haven't read as much on termites. It became obvious to me that that was also a way to gain insight into human organization, and we'll have to get on into that. But would you consider, and you mentioned the difference between humans and let's just say ants and termites, being perhaps a difference in culture. At least we don't perceive that insects have culture. So would you think there is a more than ant world, since we're both engaged in agriculture and we have this fundamental structure among humans and let's just say agricultural ants? Should we also think of a more than ant world?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You can just have a short answer. Yeah.
We should think of a more than ant world, but the more than ant world doesn't have the same significance as the same relational significance necessarily as the more than human world. See how I can explain this.
Are we just a different scale? Books and culture
it's a
and
different
thumbs?
Scale, and ants evolved their systems over millions and millions of years. And so it becomes probably somewhat a more kind of ecological kind of balancing of things over a very long expanse of time. For humans, it happens very, very rapidly. Okay. But I think the point is that in both cases, they do develop this kind of insular, if you will, and that may not be the right word. I searched for the right words in what I was thinking. This kind of insular economic structure with certain kinds of feedback loops that were taking place, and this particular play on sociality. So in that sense, they both have these systems that stand as a thing of itself. Okay. And so in that sense, in relation to everything else, there is this similarity.
Right.
And also ants don't have the cultural kind of extensions that humans have, and they're not as big as humans, and they evolved their systems more slowly than humans. So in all those ways, they're different. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that's fine. Yeah, I don't have the ant book, but I think you're aware of this. I think you maybe mentioned it in your book that, the mass of ants is roughly the same as the mass of humans on Earth, right? So here's a statement. It's a compliment. I'm just going to read it, and then I'll go to another question. I have witnessed numerous interesting and valuable presentations over the years. This one is near the top, if not at the top. I highly value multidisciplinary thinking. So there's just a new fan of yours
Well, thank
right
you very
there.
much.
So
Appreciate that.
I was going to read that out. Okay. So here's, I don't know, sort of the grand question. How do you suppose a world where humans are in connection with the earth, or how would this world look like? Is it some post-capitalism world? Is it post-agriculture type of world? Or, you know, you can say whether you think this is the right question or wrong question, but it's a big one.
Definitely don't think it's a post-agricultural world, but the nature of the way we grow food would have to change. And we have to move away from industrial agriculture, which is a really bad proposition from the perspective of energy and erosion and all of that kind of stuff. So our method of growing food has to change. And I don't know in that, I've been asked this before, how many people we could feed in that kind of world, okay, if we grow food more ecologically. I mean, people who are engaged in organic farming and that sort of thing, I think feel pressured to tell us we can grow enough food to feed everybody in that way. And then, of course, feeding is a matter of what you eat as well. So it's complicated in that sense as well. But that has to change. Does capitalism have to change? I think certain aspects of it do have to change. And, you know, I say that the form of surplus in a capitalist system is profit. It's difficult to have a perspective that profit is an endless proposition. And so I think we have to begin to move away from that, not in some kind of ideological fashion and some, you know, political discussions about whether you're a socialist or not a socialist or all that kind of stuff, but in the sense of just realizing that if we have this system that is very expansionary, its surplus is in the form of profit. We probably need to do something to curtail that if we want to curtail the expansionary dynamic of the system. And I don't know how we go about that. But I think those conversations should not be ideological if we can get away from them being ideological. I think that's not productive. Instead, what I want to say is, if we want to give the more than human world, and I guess I say more than human world because I want to imbue it with the same significance and the same rights as the human world. If we want to protect it, then we've got to limit what we do. And so we have to have discussions about the best way to limit it. And I think profit needs to come into those discussions. So yes, it's going to be a revised version of the economic system we have. And whether we have the chance or the opportunity or the power to change it is still a question in my mind.
Right. Well, here's a question which I think you're partially addressing, and then you can elaborate as you choose. I'll just read it for expediency here. How do you propose we institute an economic system that is resilient to capitalism? I think you're kind of trying to address this. It mentions Murray Bookchin proposes an active citizenry in a direct democratic system to mitigate emergence of hierarchies and entrenching capitalist trends, perhaps entrenching the sort of social power you might be referencing there. So are you familiar with this work, or how do you think any elaboration on this type of idea of maybe a more direct democracy?
Yeah, second reference to Murray Bookchin that I've had in a couple of weeks. And so I'll have to go back. I read Murray Bookchin years ago, in fact, decades ago. Okay. I am a big advocate of citizen participation and collective kind of decision making, although at times it can be quite inefficient. That doesn't mean I don't think it should take place, but I think that it's a little bit slower moving proposition. I think it's probably easier right now to just think about taking certain sectors of the economy out of the for-profit system. What sectors of the economy should be taken out of the for-profit system where we would be as well off if they're in a different kind of structural arrangement. I mean, I could say healthcare, for example, and probably energy.
Yeah, well, some
And
countries,
whether those, and
not 100% of the world, less than 100% has privatized healthcare and energy. But go ahead.
Yeah, and they do a much better job with their certainly their healthcare expenses and its relationship to being healthy. And so I think that it's probably a good idea to start thinking in those terms and then think creatively about, for example, whether energy is a localized matter. Energy co-ops make sense, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's probably the way to begin to think about things.
I think the Texas, the winter freeze here 2 years ago in Texas posed some difficult questions because there were many electrical cooperatives for historical reasons from the New Deal. It's a couple of them. One of the biggest ones kind of got wiped out. If we have these savvy kind of market systems, certain institutions may or may not be more prone to be able to keep up with all the rules and complications. So it's a good question. I'm going to blend two questions here that are sort of similar. They're kind of in the framework of limits to growth and are we experiencing this? That's going to be my short summary of this. But here goes question one. How does negative population growth in many countries influence your views? And if the population stops growing, is this a sort of natural limit to growth, or is this, one of the signs we would look for? So China, I guess. I think I heard South Korea has like the lowest fertility rate ever recorded. I don't know what the number is. Mm-hmm. Second question, similar. Do you think slowing down of supply chains as a result of COVID is an opportunity to start thinking beyond agriculture and capitalistic systems in terms of their, insufficiency to serve needs of humans and perhaps your more than human world? So those are both limits to growthy kinds of questions. Are we experiencing things? Should we be interpreting what we've seen in the last 5, even maybe just 5 years as some sort of evidence of that?
I don't know if it's evidence of limits to growth or evidence that the system, and I've talked with John a little bit about this, I know he's thinking about it, or whether it's an indication of kind of reaching limits. It's maybe an indication of reaching limits of complexity in the economic system. How that relates to growth, I have to think more clearly about.
Right. Can I just add one thing there? So,
sure.
And that's not to talk to my own horn much, but we're so similar in how we think that we're having a good conversation. So in 2016, I published a paper looking at least a metric of complexity of the U.S. economy and only looking at economic data and input-output tables for those of you familiar with that. So it's just looking at the structure of the money in those tables. And in some sense, information theoretic metrics had its level of highest complexity around in the year 2000 or 2002, and then has been decreasing since then. And 2002 or around 2000 was the cheapest food and energy in history, as I highlight in my book. So this whole posited linkage of many of us on amount of energy or relative cheapness of energy or high ROI and the link to the structure of society does seem to be there in some of the just normal economic data.
Interesting. I'll have to get your paper.
Yeah,
Karen,
we can follow up
and take a look at it. We'll have to do that. I think that we are experiencing kind of a kind of falling back from complexity. I think that lower population growth rates may also have a lot to do with distributional problems, which have gotten progressively worse in the economy because young people of reproductive age, don't see an economic landscape which allows them to think about forming families and having children in the way that previous generations have. So I think there's that problem. I don't see negative population growth as a bad thing, but I do recognize that it does create real stresses in the system, and that you have to have a way of compensating for that. And that's a very complicated issue. If we start thinking about Social Security, for example, just in the United States, now there's all kinds of ways that we can deal with that. We can raise the income level on Social Security, and have more revenue coming in that way. But I think that it's complicated. There's a lot of older people who are poor. So it's complicated with distributional problems, but for older people who are not poor, I think, for example, people of my generation need to have more kind of modest aspirations for how they fill out the last 25 years of their lives.
Right. We're kind of seeing some of this play out in real time. I definitely appreciate your way of thinking. You kind of mentioned getting away from ideology and certain kinds of economic discussions, and this population, I think, is one of those. I think in my book, I kind of say it's not that population, let's just say shrinkage or decline, is good or bad. It's just something that I might expect to happen, and you're going to have to think about how to deal with it. And the protests in France are perhaps very much about this, right? The current protests about whether to increase the retirement age, and
right,
you could say it's better for climate and reducing environmental impact to keep the retirement age low, because if you keep working, you're going to produce more stuff, right? Although maybe
right.
not.
Well, that's a complicated thing.
Yeah, very complicated. Okay, well, I think it's been a great discussion. I thank you very much for your thoughts. And there's another congratulatory comment there on your presentation. So this has been Lisi Krall, professor of economics, State University of New York, Cortland. If you want to learn more from her, then yes, buy her book, Bitter Harvest. Thank you very much, Lisi. Thank you for joining us at the Energy Symposium.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the audience for coming, especially competing with the Donald Trump spectacle.
His booking, here, April 4th.
But it's unfolding as I speak.
2023, a day that will go down as